back to reading this book, Intolerant of Tolerance. I'm just gonna read this a page over. So it says the scouts must pay up or stop discriminating against homosexuals and atheists, quite apart from questions of equally who really owns that building and which none of the money invested came from the city. Would it not be more pluralistic and genuinely tolerant for the city to say that if homosexuals or if atheists want to build a similar institution, the city of Philadelphia would be just as helpful to them as they have been in the past to the scouts? No, that would never do. What the new tolerance means is that government must be intolerant of those who do not accept the view definition of tolerance. In these two locations, San Diego and Philadelphia, stand for numerous other struggles the Scouts have enduring during the past decade, mostly on the coast, all in the name of tolerance. It is not easy to predict how these and similar cases would turn out 2 years ago in Massachusetts. Catholic Charities was told it had to withdraw from its adoption services or change its policies and become willing to place children with same-sex couples. Catholic Charities stopped its service. How this will benefit needy children in that state is lost in their clear. One might argue that Catholic Charities could have and should have put up a better fight. World Vision, an evangelical charity, requires that its employees refrain from intramural sexual activity, including, of course, homosexual activity. In 2005, the World Vision was awarded $1.5 million by the Office of Justice Programs to address escalating juvenile and gang violence in Virginia. And eventually the lawyers were called in to determine if the World Vision was discriminatory. The Department of Justice eventually, 2007, ruled in favor of World Vision on the basis of the Religious Freedom Restoration Act of 1993. After all, as Carr Esbeck, a law professor at the University of Mississippi, observes, non-religious organizations receiving federal grant monies freely hired based on their core mission, just as Planned Parenthood requires that employees be pro-choice and Sierra Club screens advocates based on their view of global warming. Religious groups likewise cannot remain true to their founding credo purposes unless employees are aligned with the overarching core of the mission. Indeed, Esbeck goes on to say, one has never disagreed with others about religion. It is not nearly commonly tolerant, but is treating religious differences as if religious beliefs do not matter. That is just a soft form of religious bigotry. And sometimes common sense prevails, and sometimes it doesn't. On June 29, 2004, Pastor Eggering was sentenced to 1 month in jail for showing disrespect against homosexuals in a sermon he delivered from his pulpit in the small town of Borgholm, Sweden, on July 20th, 2003. In 2008, the Supreme Court of California ruled that 2 physicians could not legally refuse artificial insemination to a woman because she is a lesbian, and the doctors had not withheld the service because they disagreed with her. They argued that they happily provide medical care to all kinds of people with whom they disagree. They would not withhold cancer treatment from a rapist, for example, but where they felt they had to draw a line was in their own participation in an act that they judged to be immoral. It was not as if the patient of Gallipoli Benedis could not obtain the services elsewhere. The lawsuit was not about being unable to obtain the medical services she desired, but about making a point In its decision, the court state due the right to religious freedom and free speech as guaranteed in both the federal and the California constitutions, except a medical clinic physicians from complying with the California Civil Rights Act's prohibition against discrimination based on a person's sexual orientation or enters no. The word is important. If homosexuals is made an exclusively civil rights issue, then the court will be tempted to limit the First Amendment rights time again. The issue is becoming complicated. Elaine Photography, a business owned by an evangelical husband and wife team, refused to photograph the gay commitment ceremony of two women in 2006. Vanessa Willard filed a complaint with a New Mexico Human Rights Commission, which eventually found against Elaine Photography, ordered its paid to $6,000, $637 for Will Cox legal fees. The decision was appealed to the district court. Once again, Elaine Photography lost December 2009. Photographically is appealing. If business owners are forced to do something against their own conscience, such as a photography company owned and operated by deep committed vegetarians, being forced to photograph the slaughter of animals and the preparation of meat for a butcher shop, where is the tolerance and equally in that? Outside the U.S. nations, ostensibly in favor of human rights are becoming increasingly restrictive. In England, a Catholic school was recently forbidden to fire its openly gay headmaster. I don't know these words. Most of them I don't understand how to pronounce. Parochial Anglican schools are forbidden to teach that homosexuality is sin. In Canada, the Alberta Human Rights Commission forbade a Christian pastor from making disparaging remarks about homosexuality or even repeating biblical condemnations. In the past, there has been no sorts of cruel and contemptible things said about and to homosexuals by conservatives, but it seems to many of us that unrestrained venom now more characteristically flows in the opposite direction. When she was still Miss California, Carrie Beechan was asked what she thought of gay marriage. She replied that marriage should be between a man and a woman. And no offense to anybody out there, but that's how I was raised. And she did not turn out to be the best defender of the traditional rule. But her language was mild compared with what was thrown back at her. I don't want to say this cuss word. So they called her a dumb B word with half a brain. Opinion Perez Hilton, a gay clueless, an ignorant disgrace who makes me sick to my stomach, writes Gulling Ranas E News Inter. This is the tolerance that is being commended. So she believes that a normal marriage is between a man and a woman, and that's how I believe. And so how I believe that people are intolerant of that. They get their all in their feelings. Like, why can't you agree with us? Like, I don't have to agree with you. Like, I can have my own view. Like, force your stuff down my throat. Everybody's not gonna agree with you. And they wanna be like all crybabies, get on their feelings, and be like pouting children, having tantrums because of how you believe in your Christian faith, because they're intolerant people. And they're the ones with the problems. I'm not doing nothing to nobody. I just practice my Christian faith. And I'm really strong on my Christian faith convictions. Read my Bible, go to church. You don't see me hurting people, trying to attack them because I disagree with them. Or being mad, like, that's crazy. I mean, I'm mad at sin, but I'm not going to attack people. I'm not going to hurt people. I can live freely and be tolerant if the person disagrees with me. I'm not like them, like, doing stuff to people, trying to hurt them, trying to attack them, trying to harass them because they don't like my views. The target of Christianity. At the risk of sounding paranoid or petty, I must say that a disproportionate part of the intolerance that masks itself as a new tolerance is directed against Christians and Christianity. Public libraries have been known to ban a book such as John MacArthur's Safe in the Arms of God in several countries, Australia, Canada, and the United Kingdom. Maybe I should get that book because I want to read it now. The legislation has been passed that has resulted in Christian pastors being hauled before the courts and sometimes found guilty of hate crimes on the ground that they have given public addresses that contrasted Christianity and Islam in ways that were judged to glorify Islam. I know of no instance in these countries where similar charges were brought against an inmate for comparisons running in the opposite direction. In 2004, in the Russian city of Besan, Islamic terrorists took 1,200 people hostage in a public school, and they ultimately slaughtered 344 people, and 186 of them students. On a smaller scale, but still horrific, 2 disturbing students massacred 13 people at the Columbine High School. In the wake of some events, it is not surprisingly that many schools have run drills so that teachers and students alike will have some idea how to react if such violence breaks out in their schools, locking classroom doors, staying below window level, and so forth, while coordinating the work of police and other public safety officials. In New Jersey in April 2007, one such drill was run by the Burlington Police Department. And who were the mock terrorists supposed to be? Homeschooling Christian fundamentalists. 3 years earlier, a similar drill in Muskegon County, Michigan featured homeschooling wackos who detonated a bomb on a school bus. Some local inspiration followed, but can you imagine what would happen if the mock terrorists had been depicted as turban-wearing Islamic jihadists? Can one think of a single instance of organized Christian homeschoolers threatening, let alone carrying out terrorist violence? I have already listed a handful of instances of intolerance in colleges and universities. Of course, the individual evidence by itself does not demonstrate a trend. 1 or 2 recent essays, however, in addition to providing many more examples, document case after case of astonishing intolerance, where the only common ingredient was that the student officially member in question was a Christian. Scott Savage. Volunteered to serve on a book selection committee that recommended books for the freshmen. Others on the committee listed a number of books from a leftist perspective Savage, a quiet, pacifist suggested several conservative volumes, including David Kipling's The Market of Evil, which refers to homosexual behavior as sinful or evil. Some homosexual facility complained that this book recommendation made them feel unsafe on the campus, and to the facility and wrote it without dissent to accuse the student of sexual harassment. Emily Brooker saw no problem in exploring alternative views on sexual and family matters in the classroom, but she refused to sign a joint letter whose purpose was to support same-sex family adoption. For this that she was investigated by the social worker department and charged with ethics violations. A professor of English literature at Sonoma State University, lecturing on James Joyce, drew a picture of two mountains on the board of the front of the class, stated that Joyce's ethical background taught him that the one mountain represents God and the other represents human beings, and the only way between the two. Here he drew a cross in the valley, touching both peaks. Was Christ on the cross connecting people with God? He then broke into peals of laughter, drawing the class into the humor. Quite apart from the fact that this is not a good way to teach English literature, can one imagine getting away with this if the derision had been directed against Buddhism or Islam, or against Muhammad himself? Remember those Danish cartoons? In many circles, it seems that the only broadly the stanch and derision still permitted is anti-Christian. In the nature of the case, this variation is in support of what is widely perceived to be a more tolerant outlook. It is not in derision perplexes Christians if they know their Bibles. They will not be too surprised. John chapter 15, verse 18, verse 25. What surprises and perplexes Christians when they face the sword of Abraham is that it is offered in defense of large-hearted tolerance. In any society, various sectors criticize other sectors, and the right criticizes the left, and the left criticizes the right, and none of that is troubling in a liberal democracy. All of it is healthy. What is unhealthy is the right's criticism that does not engage with the views of a particular party, but merely dismisses them and tries to expel them from the disclosure on the ground that they are intolerant. As this book was being written, the remarkable responses to Brigham hit the press. He was asked on a Fox News panel what advice he would give to Tiger Woods in the wake of Tiger's tragic sex scandal. Among other things, Human said rather softly and gently, he said, to be a Buddhist, I don't think that faith offers the kind of forgiveness and redemption that is offered by the Christian faith. And my message to Tiger would be, Tiger, turn to the Christian faith and you can make a total recovery and be a great example to the world. The explosive reaction was predictable. Tom Shells, TV critic of the Washington Post, derisively mocked the notion that Christians should run around trying to drum up new business. Whom doesn't really have the authority? Does he? Unless one believes that every Christian, by minute, must proselytize. And the remark were probably right, as one of the most religious of the year. He has just about 500 million Buddhists on the planet, and Keith Oberlin, formerly of NBC, declared that Hume had tried to frighten Tiger Woods into becoming a Christian. David Shasharabian's colleague charged that Hume had degraded his own religion by bringing it up on a talk show and found Hume's comments truly embarrassing. Blogger Andrew Sutherland called Hume's comments pure sectarianism, an unpopular attempt to abolish the distinction between the solar and religious discourse. The criticism of Hume prompted a raft of reflections. Felt what Hume said about Buddhism was excellently correct. Every religion includes in its structure some understanding of what it is wrong with human beings and present a solution. For Christianity, the root problem is sin. Idolatrous defiance of the one creator God. The solution is forgiveness of sin secured by Christ's death and resurrection. For Buddhism, the root problem is ignorance about the true nature of reality, in particular, the impairment of all things, and ignorance that results in craving and attachment. The solution, therefore, is enlightenment. And one may argue, which of these two perceptions of reality, if either, is true? Human's point, however, is this. He understands Tiger Woods to have committed sin, and what Tiger most needs is forgiveness, not least forgiveness by God as part of the healing and transformation he hopes Tiger experiences. That is a Christian anais, of course, but granted that this sort of forgiveness is what Tiger needs. Tiger is not going to find it in Buddhism, where the structure of thought is entirely different. There is no sin in Buddhism, as many religions conceive of sin. Some thoughtful Buddhists replied by offering their alternative structure, that is fair dialogue, in a liberal democracy. And what was lacking from so many immediate opponents, when the critics mock human for supposing he has a mandate to proselytize Christians quietly and smile and remember the Great Commission. If by proselytizing one means something like try to win people to faith in Jesus by humble articulation of the gospel and without any internal coram, that is exactly the mandate that Christians have. In the long haul, there can be no freedom of religion unless people of competing faith and of no faith are free to proselytize, free to try to convince others. In any case, isn't that exactly what Armin Susher and Saran are trying to do, to convince people that their view of reality is correct? The thoughtful Christians will not want Armin Susher, I don't know how to say that weird name, and Soviet to be silenced or to withdraw from the marketplace of ideas. They were merely note with quiet irony that most intemperate language is being used by those calling for tolerance to accuse human of dissing Buddhism because he disagrees with it, is to cast a reader spin on humans' comments. But fair-minded readers may be excused for thinking that human is being dissed rather more readily. Someone's charge that human has crossed the border between secular and religious discourse already proposes. The intrinsic stupidity of seeker discourse in that religious discourse is rival and respectful only when it is utterly private, but countless millions cannot agree with, and Sobelin presents no argument for justifying that stance. He merely proposes it and tries to oppose it on others. As for the assumption that religion in general and Christianity in particular must be entirely privatized, that is something to be explored a little later in this book. We ought to remind ourselves, however, of the way that liberal democracy is supposed to work. The price of citizenship in a liberal democracy is citizens will not oppose their convictions on others. They will not use the power of state to force belief. Each person is free to practice his or her belief or unbelief. But as Ross Stupert rightly points out, that this theory in practice, the admirable principle that nobody should be persecuted for their beliefs often blurs into the more illiberal idea that nobody should ever publicly criticize another religion or champion one's own faith as an alternative or say anything whatsoever about religion outside the privacy of church, synagogue, or home. Of course, these illiberal notions have as much right to a hearing as does that Christianity of Britain. But if these illiberal notions gain broad sway, then non-human Christianity would be responsible for squashing pluralism. This needs a little more unpacking. After the destruction of the World Trade Center, Andrew Silverling wrote an article for the New York Times Magazine comparing Christian fundamentalists with Muslim terrorists on the ground that both hold to exclusive beliefs. But this Ananias misconstrues both the nature of the democracy and the locus of the real danger. The danger does not lie in totally held exclusive beliefs. Compare the mutually exclusive economic analysis of Ronald Reagan and Barack Obama. Mutually exclusive beliefs, religious or otherwise, are not dangerous, provided there is also a mutual commitment to ongoing discourse, to older kind of tolerance. As Duane Lipping puts it, the danger, whether under religious auspices, the Inquisition, the Taliban, or secular Nazism, Stalinism, stems from the toleration recourse to the coercion. In this light for Sullivan to evoke the fundamentalists of a Jerry Falwell to that of Osama bin Laden is both unfair and misguided. So, jottings on the history of tolerance. Every culture and every age necessarily displays some tolerance and some intolerance. No culture can be tolerant of everything or intolerant of everything. It is simply not possible. A culture that tolerates, say, genocide, the Nazis will not tolerate, say, the Jew if wants to kill or homosexual practice. A culture that tolerates just about every sexual violation may nevertheless balk at, say, rape or pedophilia, or in many cases, bigamy and polygamy. If we are going to think carefully about tolerance and intolerance, a little historical perspective will help. As the chapter title suggests, there are mere jottings, observations on certain movements and writers who have influenced discussion of tolerance across the centuries, including some contemporary thought on the matter. Since we are casting an eye backward across the centuries, the tolerance of which I am now writing is of course what I have called the older tolerance. It is nicely defined by Edward Lingeret. Toleration is the enduring of something disagreeable. It's basically what I said earlier, was trying to say. Toleration is the enduring of something disagreeable. Thus, it is not indifference toward things that do not matter, and it is not broad-minded celebration of differences. It involves a decision to forego using powers of coercion. So it is not merely resignation at the inevitability of the disagreeable, although begrudging toleration can be granted when one believes the coercion, while possible, will come at too high a price. Tolerating another's action is quite compatible with trying to change another's mind as long as one relies on rational persuasion, or perhaps emotional appeals, rather than blunt threats or pseudo brainwashing. Religious toleration generally applies to expression or acting upon theologically related beliefs, although the more holding of beliefs or the persons holding them have also been the objects of intolerance and toleration. In spite of some behavior similarities, toleration is distinct from the sort of pluralistic enthusiasm that seeks consensus on central religious matters or views other religious beliefs as simply different routes to similar goals. We can take religions extremely seriously and believe that we are clearly right and others are intrinsically wrong on a matter of huge and holy significance, and still decide to tolerate the propagation of the error. It may be helpful to indicate briefly the direction that the historical doctrines taken in this chapter. These doctrines are not merely random observations on what took place in the past, rather they illustrate the cross the ages the best thinking on the subject. However diverse, they place a remarkable connection between one's understanding of tolerance and one's understanding of natural law, a public moral law, or whatever it is called in various contexts. Historic treatments that fail to probe this connection, however interesting, their discrete observations, however easily or unwillingly evaded tolerance to the place of supreme ritual, so that its relations with other virtues are largely absurd. The result is that tolerance itself is distorted. J. Charles rightly argues that in the pre-Christian Greco-Roman world, the line from Hurlius through Aristotle, I don't know that word again, Aristotle, down the Dialectics embrace a form of what would later be called natural law theory, a vision of moral order based on human nature and the outworking of that nature and reason. In the Christian heritage, the massive influence of Thomas Aquinas, whether within the Roman Catholic tradition and articulation of natural law, are sometimes adapted, especially in the Reformed tradition, to speak of the immorality and the contracts of common grace. Worked itself out in the very ethical structures was sought the common good in any culture. Within such large fragments of moral reasoning, tolerance is seen as a virtue because of its concern for the common good. Once tolerance is cut loose from this larger moral vision, however, it becomes shackled to notions of individual freedom to do what one pleases. Absent much consideration of common good, it becomes quite a different sort of beast, and Charles might usually devote more attention to the teaching of Jesus regarding the distinction between Christ and Caesar and the role that Jesus' teaching played in the development of tolerance. In the West, we will shortly have occasion to reflect on this theme. Yet the tight connection and Charles maintains between tolerance and moral vision is not only historically important, but also must play a major role in our assessment of what is happening today. A.J. Connors argues along similar lines. He tries to trace its toleration in its application through history, focus especially on such figures as John Locke, about whom I say more below, to demonstrate the history toleration was tied to societies that had a shared moral vision and a conscience, while today it is far more tightly tied to individual freedom, instead of protecting minority groups as part of public policy for the common good. The enforced centration of individual freedom encourage irrationally the consideration of power and foster indifference to values other than the value of tolerance itself. Amy Chua Anais of the history of tolerance is rather different in her book In the Damn Empire, how hyperpowers rise to global dominance and why they fall. She argues that the world empires, China's Tang Dynasty, Persia and Emperor Rome, the British Empire, the United States demonstrates in their expansion period a remarkable tolerance for pluralism and diversity, which has the effect of wait. Okay. For the history focused especially on such figures as John Locke, about whom I say more below to demonstrate the history of toleration as tied to societies that had a shared more vision and a conscience, while today it is far more tightly tied to individual freedom. Instead of protecting minority groups as part of the public policy for the common good, the enforced saturation of individual freedom encouraged a violently decentralization, a power and fosters indifference to values other than the value of tolerance itself. The races to attract the empire itself. This is what she calls strategic tolerance. The decline of an empire is marked by increasing desire to control everything and to cultivate the emotion of tolerance. The tipping point comes when enough people begin to rebel against the intolerance and begin in these restrictions generating strife, discord, hatred, and violence. In short, the seeds of the decline and the destruction of the empire. This is the sort of sweeping fiat that has just enough plausibility to make a splash in a public square, and there are enough historical holes in the work, however, to make one pause. In their treatment of the early period of any empire, Chair tends to lavish praise for every instance of tolerance while ignoring instances of intolerance, and even in the reverse procedure for the later period. Doubtless, the Romans were progressive. In their day, in the time of Jesus, it was imperial policy to allow the diverse religions in the empire to openly, fairly free. Indeed, it was an offense, a capital offense, to desecrate a temple, any temple. The aim of being, of course, to avoid major religious conflict. I suppose this is the kind of tolerance of diverse religions. Of course, that the Romans also insisted on god swaps. Local conquered people were expected to accept some of the Roman gods into their own rather than them, while the Romans happily adopted some of the local gods into theirs. This god swap might appear to be happily tolerated in Miriam. I don't know what to say that weird word, but of course it was for the sake of stiffing rebellion. If locals were tempted to throw off the Roman yoke, at the very least, they could no longer count on the local gods to be only on their side. Moreover, once the Senate got into the habit of defying deceased emperors and demanding that its citizens offer a pinch of incense to the defiled Caesar, and the priestly to the defiled living Caesar, the polytheists who made up most of the empire had no difficulty complying. But was this strategic tolerance or Machiavellian manipulation? The Jews, of course, were an exception to Roman imperial policy, since they had no gods to swap and no figures representing gods. Worse, they stubbornly insisted that their God was Lord of all, and that they were not going to offer incense to any Caesar, dead or alive. The Roman gritted their teeth and viewed them as misery and stranger, but not a big enough threat to squash until, of course, AD 66-70, and again in the 2nd century AD 3152-135. As long as the Roman authorities perceived Christians to be a species of Jews, Christians could more or less hide under Jewish exceptionalism. When the divide between Jews and Christians became ever clearer, Christians faced repeated rounds of Roman persecution until about AD 300, constant progress conversion to Christ. Indeed, it is often argued that emperors such as Trajan, who wanted to return to the empire to pagan despot and who was therefore more brutal with Christians, and thus less tolerant, was nevertheless better for the empire itself at the juncture priestly, because he imposed extra discipline. He was more intolerant life in Roman history are more suitable than Schroer thinks. As for her treatment of the United States, she praises the U.S. for being tolerant toward Jews and other Europeans, many of them scientists who gained access to the country during Hitler's rise to power and its consequent strengthening the U.S. and put it into a position where it could defeat the Axis power, but she says nothing about American intermittent Japanese during World War II at roughly the same period. The scuffling act of strategic tolerance, indeed, at the time the announcement was viewed as an act of high strategic tolerance. She lavishes and praises on the U.S. for allowing and sometimes inviting so many people in the previous century to enter the country today in this early strategic tolerance. It tends to gloss over the treatment of Native Americans, writing as she does for the land of the of the Bush era. The first point of her curiosity is how close America is to loss of strategic tolerance and the adoption of intolerance that will spell its decline. But she exhibits no feel for the increasing power relation between the old tolerant and new and little grasp of how there is rising ironically an increased tolerance that is being tolerantly enforced by law on those who disagree. Similarly, unlike the works of Charles and Conrad's Schroer's book neglects to place tolerance within a broader assumed moral vision framework. What is trustworthy, obvious, and all of these analyses is how every society mixes tolerance and intolerance in complex ways to mix that is grounded in a certain moral vision and all the pragmatic and even corrupted decisions that flow from that vision. This is true in a pagan world, the Christian world, in any other world for that matter. And during the church, first 3 centuries or so, the dominant criticism Christians received from the diverse pagans of the Roman Empire was that their religion was too exclusive. Silus and many other scholarly pagans were happy to defend one branch of pagans fought against another, but none of them claimed to represent the only way to the divine. It follows that all of them took umbrage at the claim of Christians that Christ provides the only way to eternal life. All the ancient critics of Christianity were united in affirming that there is no one way to the divine. It was not the kaleidoscope of religious practices and feelings that was the occasion for this discussion of religious pluralism. In ancient Rome, it was the success of Christianity as well as its assertion about Christ and about Israel by appealing to a particular history as the source of knowledge of God. Christian thinkers transgress the conventions that govern civilized theological discourse and inquiry. The attitude toward Christians, all in the name of a more tolerant view of different pagan religions, evidently constituted part of the backdrop that made the cycles of official Roman persecution of Christians the most violent, intolerant, a morally simple pattern in the culture until the numbers of Christians and the quality of their lives and sufferings began to modify public perception. Until that occurred, a tolerance toward Christians was widely perceived as a virtue. Not surprisingly, during the early centuries of the church's existence, Christians could passionately defend tolerance. Toward the end of the 2nd century, of the church existence, Christians could passionately defend tolerance. Toward the end of the 2nd century, Torah Christians wrote, "If it is a human law and a natural right, and one should worship whatever he attends, the religious practice of one person neither harms nor helps another. It is no part of religion to coerce religious practice where it is free by choice, not creation that we should be led to religion. Again, see that you do not give a reason for imperious religious practices so that I may not worship as I wish, but I'm forced to worship what I do not wish." About a century later, Livers wrote, "Religion is to be defended not by putting to death, but by dying, not by cruelty, but by patience, not by imperious act, but by faith, for nothing is so much a matter of free will as religion. For if the mind of the worshipper turns away, it is carried off and nothing remains." He goes on to say, religion cannot be a matter of creation. It has to do with the will. With the continuous settlement, Christians suddenly found themselves allied with imperial power instead of being the advantaged religious community in the empire, that they now enjoy the advantages of being associated with the empire that called forth new rounds of affection of the relations between the church and state, and of the minor tensions between tolerance and intolerance. Once Christianity became the official religion, believers were no longer in danger. Officially, center had persecution. Rarely, however, they faced two new threats: a pressure from the state to be controlled by the state, and B, the temptation to pursue power for its own sake in a way that was impossible for them before the Christian profession of custodying, or to use the power of the state to establish Christianity. So far as we know, the first Christian leader to demand, by appealing to Scripture, the suppression of pagan cults was Firmius Maturius. In his the era of profane religions, more influential by far was the authority of Augustine. His struggle against the Donatists, which occupied much of his energy in the late 4th and early 5th centuries, chronicles his shift in perspective. He became a bishop of Hippo in AD 395 and determined that to the end of the ugly schism between Catholics and Donatists, whatever how you say that, I don't know, Donatists, as merry as possible, really, to the top. I wish we would just get on with the point. Possible until he took only peaceful measures, but in the early part of the 15th century, his attitude changed. In part, he was responding to violence against Catholics. In part, he discovered that policy measures were often effective. Augustine remained apparently opposed to torture and physical coercion. Nevertheless, the stance he adopted toward the Donatists and the steps he took perhaps Christian understanding of how others should be treated. He compelled them to come in Luke chapter 14, verse 23. From the parable of the Great Supper as saturation to enforce the submission of the unbelievers, inherits a fundamental display of ripping a text out of the context. More importantly, he appealed to the civil authorities for help. Well, death is work for the soul and the liberty of air to air. He asked who the dominant Augustine is thus established the precedent which forfeited the practice of repression of the Median Church. This is not to say that everyone followed Augustine's line. For instance, in AD 593, Gregory the Great wrote to Ritters, Bishop of Ars, to the Theodore, Bishop of Ars, of a compound them for their zeal in equalizing Jews, but criticizing them for the use of curation instead of restoring to the sweetness of preaching. Nevertheless, Augustine's hardening potions pointed the way for many church leaders in later centuries. The tolerant road to tolerance in the modern period as a passive decrease in power across the centuries and civil authorities wax and wane. It's sometimes become difficult to decide if the greatest threat came from Rome attempting to control kings and other rulers, or from those rulers attempting to control Rome. What is quite clear is that by the 11th century, Europe became a persecuting society. This did not happen overnight. For 6 centuries after Augustine, there is no record of execution on religious grounds. Nevertheless, the great theologian words provided some of the saturation for development from the 11th century on. The advice of some was relatively mild. Thomas Aquinas, for instance, in answer to the question as to whether unbelievers should be compelled to the faith, or among unbelievers there are some who have never received the faith, such as the heathens and the Jews, and these are by no means to be compelled to faith in order that they may believe, because to believe depends on the will. Nevertheless, they should be compelled by the faithful. It is impossible to do so that they do not hinder the faith by their blasphemies or by their evil persuasions, of even by their persecutions. This, of course, is not exactly freedom of religion as it is currently understood in the West. Ages cough up many examples of more violent intolerance. The Papa equation set up largely numbers of tribunes throughout Europe, for example, in the late 12th century. And the Pope Voucher's fury sought to destroy the Abbey's heresy in southern France, an effort that continued for decades. One of these tribunals was set up in 1232 in the Kingdom of Auvergne, and there was never a tribunal set up by the Pavillon equation in nearby castle in 1478 commenced at the papal equation was too weak. King Fralian II and Arguin and Queen Isabel of Castile established the Spanish equation or gave it its proper name. The Trevor of the Holy Office of Equation was designed to present Roman Catholic orthodoxy by replacing the tribunals under papal control. Spanish equation remained under the direct control of the Spanish monarchy until it was formally abolished in 1833. In theory, the equation is that many Christians, Jews, Muslims, and other minorities did not come directly under its mandate. Such minorities often face other highly discriminatory laws, but on occasion they could achieve portions of power in a nation. The question was most interesting to the Roman converts, mostly Jews, and later significant numbers of Muslims who professed conversions to Catholicism, whose conversions were suspect. Jews were apparently converting in serious numbers owing to fresh outbreaks of the anti-Semitism. The Muslims were now ruled by the Spanish throne. The first 6 victims of the equation were burned at the stake in 1481. The equation was very active. The equation was very active from about 1480 to 1530. Estimatory, but probably no fewer than 2,000 people met their death in similar fashion. Those who were found guilty by the tribunals were handed over to the secular authorities for punishment. Moreover, although the equation focused on the conversion and had no direct authority over the unconverted Jews and Muslims of Spain, eventually, it was decided that one of the things that prompted apparently converted Jews to live a dual life was to maintain Jewish rights and customs. It was the presence of unconverted Jews. So the attempt to banish all Jews from certain large Spanish cities followed. I don't know what's... None of this was done in the name of intolerance, of course. Undoubtedly, some of the motives were ugly and corrupt. The lust for more power rested in the throne, the populism that finds it easy to blame minorities and stir up hate. Even confessing the goods of the weather victims, part of the motivation was to preserve what the authorities felt was the true religion. What must be observed, however, is that this effort to preserve was judged to be true religion was grounded not so much in argument in marketplace or in others of coercion. Coercion and particularly powerful sort or church and state are so intertwined. The church uses the state to impose the most severe saturation. In other words, it was not so much the commitment to a certain understanding of truth that brought about these Excreted results as defense of the truth by the use of physical coercion backed up by the state. One of the rots of the Reformation was that Europe became divided between Catholic and Protestant states. By and large, Catholics did not tolerate Protestants, and Protestants did not tolerate Catholics. That is, on both sides, there was a link in between theological commitments and secular authority. For both sides were heirs to the medial stance that was proposed at some degree of tolerance. Bathing in coercion was necessary to defend the truth. And the Cocoa installer of the Trinity of the 30 Years' Wars, 1618, 1648, brought a calcular horror. How much of this bloodshed was probably a conflict generated by theologians arguing about truth as opposed to rising nationalism, powerful fundaments, and lust for political independence is much disputed. Degenerate Beflogen arguing about truth as opposed to raising nationalism, powerful fundaments, and lust for political independence is much disputed. The role religion has played in the war has always been a matter of some debate among historians. By 1648, it was more a matter of establishing rights to land. Religion had been transmuted into moral geographically, but insofar as the wars were religious, they were forced many people to conclude that there had to be a better way. And as we should see, the rise in tolerance that was eventually spawned for groups belonging to minority religions did not come about through skepticism or empathy about religion, but sprang about up as much as from anything else through the refusal of minorities to be silenced and crushed. So I want to read the Bible. I'll be back. I'm gonna read the Bible.